Good evening, everyone. What a pleasure to be here for this occasion and in this space. I love this shop, and it's nice to be surrounded by all of these tomes and little slim volumes. Um, and I'm delighted and honored to introduce my friend and colleague, Vidyan Ravinthiran, who is here to share his work with us from his newest book, his third collection, Avidya. And I might be wrong, but I'm assuming that the title, which is a plan's name, which in Sanskrit means ignorance, or to put a playful twist of agency on the word, could mean a kind of willful unknowing or anti-knowledge. Vidyan did his BA at Oxford, his MA at Cambridge, and returned to Oxford for his graduate work, receiving his PhD in 2010. After teaching stints at Cambridge, Durham, and Birmingham in the UK, he joined the Department of English at Harvard in 2020, right before COVID shut us all down. He's now the Gardner Cowles Associate Professor of the Humanities in the Harvard Department of English. We are here to celebrate Vidyan's latest book of poems from Blood Axe. But I first became aware of his writing through his prose. I encountered him first in the back pages of Poetry magazine, which I read obsessively. And here were these beautifully crafted critical essays by a guy with a Tamil name. I was trying to figure all of this out. I next encountered him in his editorial capacity with his edition of Arvind Krishna Malhotra's poetry for the New York Review of Books paperback series. Arvind is one of my oldest friends, so that brought us together in another kind of way. I was slowly but surely becoming a fangirl. And when Vidyan wrote to me, and my colleague in all things Tamil, Jonathan Ripley, who is sitting right back there, reaching out about Tamil possibilities here on campus when I joined the faculty in 2022, in true fangirl style, I let out a squeal. He's here. He's here, I said, exclaiming to myself in my office, and a lunch quickly ensued. I recently read Vidyan's Asian Other. This is a must read for everyone here. This is an incredibly moving and very important book. And it's quite unlike any other memoir I've ever read. As some of us know, his family left Sri Lanka for Leeds, leaving behind an absolutely brutal civil war on the island. Vidyan writes beautifully about horrible things, that special brand of British racism, and his resistance to his striving parents who denied him access to the Tamil language. And we hear about his son Frank and getting to know the poetics and sonics of Frank's speech and his getting on in the world. But the memoir is profoundly about poetry and showed me a new way to read poetry, how to ground your life in poems, in Keats, in Sharon Olds, in Frost, in Virgil, in Tennyson, in the exiled Sri Lankan Tamil poet Charan, who lives in Toronto, and Robert Burns. The poems that I read that really resonated with me. I read a lot of Sri Lankan literature, and I've never been to Sri Lanka. I hope to go one day. When I've been able, when I've had the time to go, I couldn't go because of the war. So I hope to get there at some point. But he writes about Jaffna, the northern 1/3 of the Sri Lankan island. It's shaped like a little, as Vidyan says, it's like a little teardrop, sort of hovering, shimmering off the coast, the southeastern coast of India. And he writes about it, and it's kind of weird, rebuilt transition from wood to concrete, how everything has been rebuilt in this hard concrete. And coming upon the word curry in Tamil script in the very middle of a poem. I also really enjoyed the poems that were titled Trinco for Trincomalee, which is one of the hardest hit cities during the insurgency and the later war. And on into England, living, as he says in one of his poems, a free verse life. Just a little more to say. My pages are stuck together a bit. One of my favorite poems in the collection is called Belair. And this is about the elephant-headed god Ganesha. And Belair, to show you how fond the Tamils are of Ganesha, they've given him this name Pelair, which means something like blessed child or blessed baby. And that last stanza of that poem, I absolutely love, because you talk about the tugs of war between impulse and form, breath and language, the pen as a torn out tooth, which is really just an utterly remarkable image. Something in these poems are so visceral. They're visceral, but they're also very beautiful. The ones about the war and the limited choices that war granted, especially to young kids growing up in Trincomalee and Batticaloa, and the murders of journalists in Sri Lanka. But of course, this also brings us very much into our current issues in Gaza, where our minds are very much on the constant assassinations of journalists. He also treats the horrible burning of the library at Jaffna in several of his poems, which basically destroyed Tamil history on the island. And then, as I was just telling Vidyan, right in the middle of the book, you encounter this wonderful series of poems that are very formal in style. There's the formalism of the poem titled Autumn, which I've asked him to read for us tonight, which is after John Keats, or Morning after Marvell. And the very strange, what I would call the epigenetics of terror, passed down like a gene, and mixing Walter Delamere with Black July, which is again just a stunning move, I think, in poetry. And you know, I would also really like it if you could read the poem Elam. If you could do that. I'm going to let you read what you want to read, but these are my very favorite ones. It was a very strange experience for me. I was in Madurai the night that Kilinochchi fell in 2008, when everything in Sri Lanka was just shutting down, and the genocide of 40,000 Tamils. Right after that happened, I mean, I lived through that when I was in South India, and watching it become a part of the terrible news cycle, and local mainland Tamils wondering how on earth they should react to this. But I'm going to let Vidyan infuse this evening here with his beautiful poetry, and yeah, and we can carry on a conversation later on if need be. If you want to come up and read, that'd be great.
Thank you, Martha. It's a really kind introduction, and thank you to the bookshop for having us.
Yes.
So I'm just going to read 5 poems, and then Martha and I will chat a bit and we can keep it quite informal, and anyone who has some questions, we're very happy to answer them. So I'm going to read a few poems I don't usually have a chance to read, you know. So this poem's called Next Time, and it's about the sort of sense of fate in my family, which I found kind of infuriating when I was younger. But the older I get, the more I kind of understand this sort of choosing of what happens to happen as a kind of destiny. So it's a poem that revolves around this phrase, everything happens for a reason, that my mother is addicted to. So next time, oh, it's also poems that are based on this old folk tale. I went through this period of sort of writing poems based on folk tales. So next time it's said with that infuriating head shrug, acquiescent, jocund wobble, figure of eight, or with a sniff kiss of my scalp. Everything happens for a reason. I won't fight it. I won't cite casualties of the war or tsunami, innocents in prison, nor incendiarists closer to home. Everything happens for a reason, said that courtier, a Tamil Leibniz, even when the king by accident sliced with a letter opener his own pinky off and locked our man up for those words. A year later, while hunting, said king was captured by those seeking a sacrifice to their god. Seeing his lopped hand, impure, they let him go. And so the king set the courtier free. I see now your wisdom, but that year you spent behind bars at my command, was that too written in the stars? Carefully, as millennia hence, his scion might ape the Englishman's habit of raising a pinky while sipping tea, his subject replied, were I, my lord, at large, I would have accompanied your highness on the hunt, been caught and killed, outspreading like the wing feathers of Garuda, 10 flawless fingers. So yes, do I understand my parents better these days? Maybe a little bit. So this poem, it's called Every Year, and it's about a panchangam, which is like an almanac. You know, it tells you auspicious dates for things. I wanted to read it today because I've just been teaching my Elizabeth Bishop class, and she has this wonderful poem called Sestina, and it's got an almanac in, and I've always wanted to try and write a sestina, and I don't really, you know, like a lot of poets write them with sort of tricks where, you know, you take the end words and you come up with alternatives and stuff like that. A student made a very intelligent point in my class just now that Bishop's so good she doesn't need to do that. But I've used loads of those cheap tricks. Okay, so every year they bought the safety yellow panchangam with its auspicious dates for a wedding, advice on bulletproofing a journey against acts of God, how to breathe and how to be forgiven, providing the meaning even of a gecko falling from the ceiling onto your head. It's all in your head. My grandfather wanted more than the panchangam. He consulted horoscopes. He decrypted the meaning of the jostling planets. An Ayurvedic doctor, he gave wedding superstition and sincerity, refusing to be a god to the poor, freely to those who made the journey to his clinic, also my mother's home, the start of her journey. She says I'm him reincarnated. When his angina came to a head, his nitrate pills couldn't be found. There is only one God, she says, and many paths, panchangam or no panchangam. It was arranged, her wedding, to my father. The morning after, as they breakfasted that morning, he ignored her, reading a book about a journey into the dark heart of a book for British boys. Did our wedding mean nothing? She asked herself. He'd a good head on him, but her father, had a heart. Still, the Panchangam declared their union auspicious, and she trusted in God. And her husband, unlike others, didn't want her to see him as God. Even as he corrected her English, her letters, her unmeaning, rote, spoken phrases, she was his Panchangam, guiding, making inevitable their journey to England. How else would the children get ahead? Neither child would suffer a traditional wedding, an arranged marriage. Our lives would be free verse, or a wedding between impulse and form, desire and history, a dead God presiding over it all. The dead live only in our heads. Shrine photos of Sai Baba have no or the wrong meaning. My wife's name just fails to rhyme with journey. Where it didn't exist, we invented a Panchangam, dispersed into countless heads, meaning after meaning, multiplying like the limbs of gods. The cliche of the journey. Let us dance as at our wedding on the grave of the Panchangam. Like I still feel, you know, a real Sestina doesn't have to do things like that. But I just find it completely impossible, you know, teaching that Bishop poem today. I mean, that's one of the great poems of the 20th century, so I shouldn't be too hard on myself, I suppose. But, you know, so that poem didn't really flag up that it was inspired by Bishop. I think it took me a while to realize that actually myself. So this is one of the poems Martha mentioned, and it does mention who inspires it, which is John Keats, and it's John Keats's great ode to autumn. And I'm so fascinated by the scholarly debates around that poem, and I'll try and make this seem relevant and interesting. So it's really that, you know, he wrote that poem in 1819, terrible things were happening in England, and, you know, the agricultural economy was a wreck, and the government was clamping down on protests for greater suffrage. And a month before he wrote that poem, there was a gathering for greater suffrage in St. Peter's Field in Manchester, and the activist Henry Hunt was arrested, and the cavalry charged into the crowd, and, you know, they killed some of the protesters and they injured loads of others. Just all these terrible things were happening. So there is some sort of Keats criticism which says it's quite moralizing, that there's something escapist about the fact that at this point in time, he wrote a poem that was sort of a bittersweet, beautiful poem about autumn. And, you know, he wasn't tweeting angrily about this stuff the way he should have been, you know. And then there's sort of people like my old professor, Tom Paulin, who also think that Keats should have written a poem about the Peterloo Massacre, but who say that To Autumn is a poem about the Peterloo Massacre, it's just in code, right? So it's just very interesting to me, because it's this idea that the poet is obligated to write about current events and about atrocities and things. So I've thought about that a lot, and a lot of the poems here come from this 2017 trip to Sri Lanka, where I saw a lot of things I hadn't seen before, like Jaffna Library. And in particular, I saw a temple where the Tower of Gods had been pushed over by the tsunami. So it was at a really wild angle. And they'd rebuilt another Tower of Gods, but they left that tower at a tilt, the previous one, so you could see it. So the poem mentions that, and he uses this word for temple, which is Poville. Autumn. The fallen yellow leaves now oftener flare red. Embers, blown up chili flakes. The burning of the library at Jaffna. Foreign dead about to break the spell of here and now. Phantasms steal into the peaceful lives we seem to have earned, telling tales about what happened, to them, not ours, and in a tongue I never learned. This is my garden, my spade of blood meal, and from our kitchen the time-travelling smell of chicken curry floats to Walden Pond. A swooping cardinal like a struck match. Above the fence, mosquitoes eddy like a pinion, crazed by a patch of red-pink light into giddy scribbling on the air. There is no need to be ashamed. I see you there and keep alive the thought of our meeting one day, brightly after the next. Black mustard seed thrums in the sauce. The sky falls asleep. Where feelings come from or may leap across and through and to, no one can say. Tsunami hit, shoved over at a tilt. They've left the bashed old Coville's god-thronged tower standing tallish beyond the new one built to face this time, becalm the ocean's power. Our autumn clouds are a far quarried rubble to which the changing light does spicy things. To sing, to fly, migrate are curious verbs. Beauty, like happiness, frailly reliable, has nothing to do with why there are wings, why birds build nests and sing their songs, or why barbed wires besotted with its barbs. So I've just been trying to write a poem in that ode form probably for almost 30 years. And I find these sort of forms fascinating. It's like, how do you get to the point where you can actually write what you want to write, not in the form, but only through using the form? I think also I like writing poems in forms because, you know, I think like a lot of people, I just spend a lot of time now just feeling incoherently angry. And it's like the only thing I really want to voice is, yet another angry opinion or a sort of expression of just flabbergasted disbelief. And it can be quite difficult to instead write a poem. And I think the forms have helped with that. So this poem is really about, England. Well, it's not anymore. I was going to say England is a cold place, but climate change. Not. England was a cold place when I was growing up, and the warm place we traveled to was Sri Lanka, and that's where you have warm evenings, warm past dusk, and you'd hear crickets. So when my wife and I and our son moved here in January 2020, and during the pandemic, and there was this travel ban, and we were quite isolated. So I'd sit there in the evening and it was very warm and I'd hear crickets. And what it would remind me of was being in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is every country where I feel and don't feel at home. A child leaving England for Colombo's eerily warm evenings and the alien language of crickets. I too was fostered alike by beauty and by fear. For many a year, through the doorway of dusk, I'd travel there. What's wrong, someone might say, or I love to see you smile, but I was far away. In lockdown with my wife and baby, in green Acton's twilight warmth, I'm that lonely boy, listening for crickets on a pink-tiled rooftop in Dehiwala. What of this country, where I live now, but should I leave, if, say, the virus touches my parents in England, my visa may bar our return. Out of caves in our garden's stone wall peeps the immortal squirrel I saw run through ancient Polonnaruwa, 3 white lines burned into its back, the finger marks of Rama. So that's in the Ramayana, when Rama has to build a bridge between India and Lanka to go there and rescue Sita, all the animals, especially, Hanuman and the monkeys, build this incredible bridge between India and Sri Lanka, but the squirrel wants to help too, so the squirrel rolls a pebble to the bridge, and so because Rama's pleased with the squirrel, he strokes the squirrel, but because he's, a god, this sort of burns 3 lines into the squirrel's back. It's the story of why the squirrel has those 3 lines. Technically, the creature in Acton is a chipmunk, but every time I see that with the 3 lines on his back, I always so this poem, this is the last one I'll read, and then a chat with Martha. And this poem she mentioned is called Erlam, and that's the word for like the homeland the Tamils wanted in Sri Lanka. But the poem is about it's about anxiety passed down the generations, and it's about, in some ways, because my family, my parents are so anxious, and you can give historical coordinates for that. If I sort of don't want to live that way, and if I sort of repudiate that anxiety, then where does that leave me and them? I think so. So that's what this poem is about. If my parents are nervy, camouflaged against carnivory, if at day's end their choice is a belief in perpetual crisis, if this autotomy and playing dead, a jettisoned tale, ink squirted, is the only language they felt it safe to bequeath, then to smile today with unclenched teeth, to sleep well, not brood and ingrate over trivially frictive grit, till the pearl of nightmare is fished, to be at peace. Wouldn't this betray my parents and my dead, dismiss as nullity all they did? Thanks. Like if I name something.
Just come up and stand next to me.
Okay,
Kind of do it that way. Okay, thank you.
Is standing okay, or would you like to put some chairs out?
I'm
I'm
fine.
good standing. It's- you write about poetry and memoir in this very remarkable book, but I'd like to know, I guess, what compelled that visit to the island in 2017.
Yeah.
Was it a trip to go and try to write about something there, or did the poems just emerge from a casual visit home? Or, I guess I would like to hear about that.
Well, it was a big trip with quite a few of us, because my wife and her parents came, but we had a, a bit where we sort of went in different directions. So they stayed down south, and I was able to travel up north with my parents for the first time and to visit the towns they grew up in. So Trincomalee and Bataclan at the end of the war were listed as containing the largest numbers of widowed families, I think is the statistic they use. So I'd never been able to visit those places before because it hadn't felt safe, or my parents hadn't thought it was safe. So as I was traveling around with them, I kept a journal, and then I thought I would like to write something at some point, but I didn't really know how. And I was working on the memoir, and poems kind of, I really like writing poems. I find it very sort of nourishing and heartening. So kind of was a good kind of displacement activity, or it's like not having to take all of that journal and write it up as prose, but instead to sort of reapproach it.
Right, and poetry, especially if you're writing in a kind of formalist vein, lets you control the chaos.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the form of the memoir is one I found very challenging and also had doubts about. But with the poems, I think a poem can be an attempt to do something that doesn't necessarily come off, and that's sort of a tremendously liberating idea.
Right. Yeah, I was also just wondering, as I said to you before we started all of this tonight, as you're reading, I read straight through the volume, and you're reading, free verse for a while. You encounter some nice rhymes and things like that, but then with that Keats poem, there's suddenly this shift into a formalist, and there's this beautiful. I'm always attracted to form, just as you know, as a misbegotten student of Writer's workshops many, many years ago in my past, you'd walk into a classroom and Donald Justice would stare you down and say, okay, write a sonnet. And we would all kind of freeze and get out our pencils and do our best. But you know, I think I'm attracted to those poems because a lot of my early classwork when I was at the University of Iowa was all sort of centered on the workshop and on experimenting with form. And I also found you know, writing in a more formal vein, as you said, it's kind of freeing.
Yeah.
And it gives you a map. You know, you need to have this word there and that word there, and you need to, you know, you need to find out a clever way to get your ideas across.
Yeah.
And writing in form gives you that kind of freedom.
Yeah.
I think. In a lot of ways, people feel constrained by form, but I always found it fun.
Yeah.
And encountering those poems, and especially that poem that you read for us, Autumn, really, you know, leads me to this question, and I'm wondering why and when John Keats became such an important part of your own consciousness as a poet, and he also is a very important figure in your memoir. Just
like there's another poem in the book which is about this assassinated Sri Lankan journalist with Prema Thorngall, and there's a Keats poem sort of comes into that too. And I remember when I was workshopping that poem, and the suggestion from the people in the workshop was, the Keats stuff doesn't belong here. You know, I think the older I get, the more I sort of feel able to leave in like the way that I'm thinking about things. The Keats, I've been trying to write something about this actually, because I'm meant to travel somewhere and talk about the memoir next week. And I think with Keats is he's very he feels like he's someone on a mission, and he has this destiny, and he worries that he might not be able to accomplish it. He is very determined sometimes to make the most of moments of happiness, because he always perceives happiness as something that can be taken away by something else. And I think that sort of hypervigilance is something that runs in my family, where, you know, and again, historical coordinates are possible, but it's just that I think it is possible to read poets, including, you know, the canonical poets, to have these kinds of these really visceral resonances with your own kind of particular experiences. And I think that's something that really interests me, because it's not the same as, you know, the universal human truth or idea. You know, Keats speaks to everyone, although I think that, you know, I'm trying to teach him in a way like I hope that he would. But it is more like there could be these extraordinary overlaps between people from very different backgrounds, and that those sorts of things, you know. So now I teach a Keats course, and it's weird teaching Keats at Harvard and, you know, knowing who taught it in the past. But I think partly what allowed me to write that poem was teaching Keats here at Harvard, and, you know, thinking about it a lot. Yeah.
Well, it is funny how Keats crops up. I was writing a paper, and I work a little bit on Ayurvedic medicine and Sanskrit literature, and there were these incredible descriptions of the tubercular patient there. And I found, and I included in the paper, a citation of Keats' poem to his hand, the withering, pale hand. And in the classical medical texts in Sanskrit, one of the symptoms of tuberculosis is an obsession with the hand. And it was just an extraordinary connection to make, but it brought me to that poem by Keats, and I sort of happened upon it by accident, just at the right moment when I was writing about this stuff. It was really kind of magical. But Anyone want to speak out in the audience here? Ask a question? Yeah.
I guess I had a question about when you write about your parents, like in the process of that, do you interview them to inform your writing about them, or do you try to intuit like their feelings like after the wedding and stuff? Like why?
So my parents and I are very, very close, and actually, I mean, I'm not just saying that because they might be watching on soon. I told them that, you know, it's really late in England, so you don't have to, but it's possible they'll actually watch it on soon. So, you know, we talk about anything and everything, and I think they've always had this sort of attitude of you can write about anything to do with our sort of family, and that's all right. You know, when I wrote the memoir, Norton, like they got their lawyer. I had to have a phone call with their lawyer because with a memoir they have to check that you're not going to get sued, basically. And so I thought about the people who would sue me in a memoir. I had this list, and they said, and the lawyer said on the phone, "No, I mean your family. Like your family." It's like I just take it for granted. I can say whatever I wanted about them. So yeah, I would talk to them about it, and like, and they have their different perspectives on things, and you know, my dad sort of can understand like classical Tamil poetry and has helped me do translations in the past. They have very different family lives there. You know, my mother. That's mother. My wife's also watching this. That's bad. Right. So my mother comes from like a very, very happy family, and you know, and my dad comes from quite an unhappy family in Sri Lanka, and they have some different experiences that way. But it's always interesting to sort of ask them about things. I think the trick is really to get them to move beyond the standard repertoire of anecdotes, right? which is difficult. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that I do, definitely in the criticism and jumping around and stuff, is actually just stuff that, you know, the way my family talks about things. But, you know, at Harvard, one has to narrate this as some kind of, you know, field redefining kind of scholarship, which, so that's what I'm trying to do. Yeah.
So I was a bit curious after reading your collection about how you think about sound formally, because sort of, I guess I'm partly curious about your experience of growing up with sort of the family background that you did, but in England, in Leeds, which is a place with a very particular way of speaking.
Yeah. Yeah, so when I was little, I had sort of speech impediment, which is still kind of residually there. Like I find R sounds quite tricky. So my parents sent me to these elocution lessons, supposedly to fix that. But I think they also hoped, as with my sister, that it would erase any kind of South Asian or indeed Yorkshire accent that I might pick up, and that would be sort of stigmatizing that way. So so when I was having these lessons, I remember that my tutor would sort of, my teacher, Mrs. Jarrett, would sort of write where there's a pause in a line of poetry and stuff like that, and she would look really closely at the sounds and stuff. And then when I went to Oxford, I had this tutor, Tom, and I remember he was telling us about Christina Rossetti's poetry, and he had this idea that there are pauses in the lines even when there are no commas. And I remember thinking, yes, I can actually hear that. But I think this kind of it might actually be a run in the family in some way. Like my son, I was just telling Martha, he's 6 and his name is Frank. And he said, why do we pronounce Frank like there's a silent G in it? And he meant before the K because, you know, we don't say Frank, you know, we say Frank. And I thought that's really interesting. I don't really know where this weird focus on sounds comes from there, like where he's got that from. I guess for him, it's because like he's very determined, like he feels like English and American are two different languages, and he doesn't like words that he thinks of as American, you know, like he doesn't like the word super. He doesn't like the word fun, which I'm pretty sure at one point he referred to as the F word. so it's like this kind of, there can be a sort of fastidiousness, right? But I think to me that sounds always a source of great joy, and obviously that comes back to Keats too. You know, like F. Scott Fitzgerald, I think, said like, after listening to a Keats poem, all other poetry just sounds like whistling because, you know, the sounds are so interlocking and like that. So yeah, the sound aspect of poetry is really important to me.
Thank you so much for sharing those poems. I was wondering, in a few of the poems that you read today, there's some Tamil words there as well. What for you decides like which word you render in Tamil, which one? And like as a poet, like do you feel like you need to contextualize this for the audience, or how do you feel like you interact with your audience when you introduce those Tamil words?
Well, I'm kind of hesitant, partly because, again, my parents made this decision that Martha alluded to, like not to teach me or my sister their language. And I think that's because they sort of wanted to draw a line under things. I don't think they ever considered at the time that it could be, you know, a culturally desirable thing or a resource or something like that. So I very rarely do it, but then when it's words that, you know, my parents would use, and so I do know what they mean occasionally, you know. So in this poem, yeah, the curry mention, for instance, is
well, it's written in Tamil script too.
Yeah, that was very difficult to work out.
It was.
I think it needed to be inserted as an image. Like at the moment, I don't know to what extent this is happening in US poetry, but in UK poetry, there's been this big push. You know, my co-editor of Sri Lankan anthology, Shash Trevet, who speaks Tamil and has translated poems in Tamil, says that, you know, words shouldn't be italicized. You know, foreign words shouldn't be italicized, and she feels very strongly about that. But then sometimes, yeah, like with a memoir, I think Norton wanted to and italicize things. So yeah, I guess the answer to the question is I want to keep them in and sort of recognize that they're a bit strange to me too, because it's like a big part of my life. But it was more things like my parents would speak in Tamil when they didn't want me to hear what they were talking about, you know. So I'd sort of grow up hearing this all the time, but not understanding it. And like I've thought about it that, like, I guess I can talk about death because there's enough South Asians in the room, but, you know, the US question, you know, I know Americans don't like talking about death. South Asians love talking about death. You know, so I've sometimes thought that after my parents died, you know, to actually learn Tamil might be something to do. If I can prevent myself from writing, you know, a terrible memoir about that, you know, awful. In my father's footsteps.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Something that really stunned me in one of the poems is during your time in Sri Lanka, you visited a family house, and there were bullet holes in the walls.
Yeah.
And you stuck your finger in the holes, and you know, I was just wondering about, you know, the haptic qualities that we find in some of your poetry, but it seems to be particularly focused on the Sri Lankan poems.
There's this Sri Lankan poet, Jean Arasanayagam, and she compares these bullet ruined walls at Jaffna to Jackson Pollock action paintings, which I think is really provocative thing to do. But it's that kind of, it's hard to express how surreal it is and how sort of strange it is. But it's also kind of, you know, like when we were traveling up there, it becomes a really everyday thing, for example, to see someone with a missing limb, right? So you're sort of wandering around and it's just something that you just see, or, you know, it'd be unusual to go a day without seeing that, for instance.
Yeah, there are still landmines on the beaches in the north of the island, and it's terrible. Yeah.
So it was kind of, like, I think when we were doing the anthology of poetry, though, Shash and Seni and I, when it came to the poetry of atrocity, I think when we were including, diasporic or diasporan poets like me, we kind of included poets who would register the fact that they themselves personally did not experience that kind of violence, and that really did mean cutting out a lot of stuff, which was very kind of sensationalistic about it, because it's very hard, I guess, to find a way in writing about things. And I think these sorts of like when Paul Muldoon is writing about violence in Northern Ireland, and he refers to a limb that's been cut off as like a pruned back shrub, and he's come up with that, I suppose, to avoid the usual sensationalistic sort of gore-laden way of talking about things, and to sort of preserve some sort of defamiliarizing quality about it.
Anybody else out here who wants to say something? I have other things to say, but I don't want to hog the space here. Yeah. It must have been just an incredible experience for you to go home, if it's home, and to see what you saw. And I'm sure it was just incredibly affecting. Well, especially, and again, to return to the poet-ridden house and imagining your grandparents sort of darting out and running, the grandmother running over the wall, and just escaping from there, and then coming back later to revisit Jaffna and seeing everything in concrete. That really stunned me when I was reading the poems about the concrete tables.
Just everything being made of concrete was one of the big things. There was this sort of, just to explain, that there was this sort of cafe that it was set up, and it's entirely run by women who lost members of their family in the war, so they sort of own it and run it, and sort of a way for them to make a living. So we went there, and that's the place. It's entirely made of concrete, so like a concrete bench, a concrete table. So I did want to write about those things, but then also when I was writing about them, I sort of ended up writing a bit about moving to the US too, and so it's sort of my parents migrating to England, and then Jenny, Frank, and I migrating here. So
that's right.
I had just a comment about next time. So I'm also Sri Lankan and Dublin, probably like you. I feel I find it casually infuriating being around my parents sometimes. Their mental health is through the roof, right? compared to me, despite all the hardships they've had, and they're relatively really easy life I've had. And I think one of the observations I've made is exactly their ability to come out with what seems to me like a teleological sense of meaning. I'm trained as a scientist. I'm an atheist, so I believe that everything happens for a reason only in the sense of mechanism. And they believe everything happens for a reson in the sense of intent. And I often feel like just that small divergence always puts their mental health way higher than me.
That's brilliantly expressed. I hope my parents are watching. That's exactly what it is. And yes, my parents are very buoyant, resilient people. My uncle, who experienced the brunt of this, and was fired at and was arrested, and who was left in a van when mobs were attacking it and all sorts. He's also very buoyant and resilient. And I think, and you're right, I think it is to do with that, like a kind of, I guess, a kind of ceasing from resistance and trying to control things. And I used to find this absolutely infuriating, because like if they'd say like everything happens for a reason, I'd say, but like all the stuff that happened during the Civil War, all these awful things happen for a reason. But I guess now I see it as, it's not that there's actually a sort of cosmic fate, because that I couldn't possibly believe in that. It is more about, I suppose, meaning, how they retrospectively or retroactively consider of their own lives and the stuff that happened in it. I guess Nietzsche would say, what is amor fati or something like that, you know? And I do think that it's a kind of way of relating to the world that I find very, very, very difficult, but which to them seems to come almost intuitively. Yeah.
But that too is a kind of form that they're pouring their lives into.
Yeah.
And you don't have any access to that form,
Yeah.
or I don't have any access to that form of that generation. I wanted to ask you a question about form. There is no writing in a form that does not change the form. And you have done a poem, a book of 100 sonnets, in fact, that very constraining form. I want to talk a little bit about your memoir. You said you were very anxious about the memoir form, but what you have done there is you have actually broken the form very successfully and very brilliantly, I think. It's not the novel that is the loose baggy monster of our time, but it is actually the memoir form, because everything goes. You just need to, like, you know, throw your guts onto the page. But what you've done is it's a combination of literary criticism, brilliant literary criticism. It's a combination of a reckoning with fatherhood, I think, and also a manifesto. It's such a deeply political book as well. So did you not think while you were, and you know, manifesto in a lot of ways, not just the historical coordinates you were talking about, but a manifesto for certain kind of race relations, if you will. It's a ghastly term, as we both know. But did you feel at the end of writing that memoir, I hate to call it a memoir because it's so much more than that. The people at Norton called it a bibliomemoir, and I thought that's even worse. There's no term that I can find for what you've done. But did your anxiety end at the end of that? Did you think you had done something new with that form that you were anxious about? And is that an anxiety you also have when you're writing poetry? Like you say, right, I'm going to write a sestina now. But you do not write a sestina, or you don't write the kind of September rain falls upon the house kind of sestina. You do a whole different thing. So are you more free when you're writing, when the formal constraints in poetry are in front of you?
Yeah, that's I think, like, I remember when I was an undergraduate, you know, we had a PhD student, DPhil student, come and teach us when we had our Renaissance course.
Careful now.
And he was saying, you know, your essay should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. He was sort of endlessly frustrated with me for not writing this kind of essay. And then I found it really stymieing. And I went to, like, one of the senior fellows, this is Oxford, and said all this, and she sort of cured me by throwing essentially the graduate student under the bus, which I would not want to do with a TF now. But she said, you know, it doesn't matter with you because you're interesting. And I found that a tremendous thing. And now I'm certain, you know, I've had plenty of feedback to suggest that I'm not always interesting, but there is a sort of helpless, I think maybe that's what I got from my parents, a sort of helpless originality, right? So I think that I kind of rely on that a lot of the time, that the weirdness will in some way at least produce something that is not by the books. Yeah, my parents are like that. I suppose I'm like that too. So I'm trying to sort of lean into that in various ways. But I would like more people to feel that they could do that as well, you know, whatever their background, especially, you know, what we're doing at Harvard, you know, I want our students to feel they lean into that weirdness too. But yeah.
I think we have time for one or two more.
Okay. Anybody? Anybody up there?
Yeah,
Go for it.
maybe just another comment. I think one thing that I sort of felt throughout reading all the poems, that there's a certain sorry, my vocabulary is not very good, so I can't articulate, maybe a kind of somberness.
Yeah.
And I think that's, you know, like people have told me this about, you know, Sri Lankan Tamils, to the extent that you can homogenize a big group of people. Like, you know, there's a heaviness to us that maybe like Indian Tamils don't have. And I don't know how much of this is just true to any, you know, culture that has gone through this kind of generational trauma. But, you know, one thing that I thought about a lot is I think maybe in the West, there's kind of this concept of you should almost live on, you should be extra happy, right?
Yeah.
Like we survived, and you should
Yeah,
live
yeah.
happily on behalf of all
Yeah.
the people that didn't make it. You know, if you're kind of down in the dumps, it's almost a disservice to them.
Yeah,
Whereas I feel, you know, there's that one poem you talked about anxiety, but one thing that I feel a lot is in the culture, there's one of socialized guilt
yeah,
almost, and this is something that I know I've had to try, and I haven't done it successfully, but try and work
yeah.
out of. So I just want to appreciate the way you articulated it.
Yeah, I think that kind of, like, I think my parents would feel, I mean, they would absolutely feel there was no need to feel guilty. I can imagine them getting very het up about that. But they would feel very strongly that the happiness thing. So sometimes this sort of, like, if I want to reconnect my life here with what happened, I can sense, I mean, they like the fact that I'm interested in Sri Lankan history, but I don't think they feel I should be sort of, I don't know, weighed down by it or something. And I guess that explains this non-Tamil thing as well. It's like trying to sever this connection.
I'm actually having a conversation with you, but it's very much there in the anthology that you co-edited of Tamil verse. When I started reading the book, it's a literature I know nothing about. I just realized this is a collection of unredeemed trauma, and I don't know how that cannot make its way into your own creative work as well.
Yeah, I think there's, I think my parents are kind of like, I used to feel more strongly from this pressure that, you know, you should be happy. I think now it's a bit softer in the sort of understanding that, you know, you can't be happy all the time. But yeah, the way these things get passed down the generations is often quite sort of oblique, you know. I think I'm just trying to think of like a nice way of putting it. I think that my parents have given me this tremendous ability to experience pleasure and life and the rest of it, and that's something I'm really grateful for. And I think that I see it in my uncle actually as well, who experienced all that, you know, real trauma, like firsthand, you know, the stuff. I guess that maybe I'm connected to like poetry and, you know, literary criticism, and often there is this sort of guilt, like, you know, can you have the aesthetic pleasure or something, you know, can you do that? And so I suppose maybe that's why I feel so strongly about that and the Keats thing. It just doesn't, and maybe that's connected, like that's what I feel there. I'm not feeling it as an aesthete, I'm feeling it as someone who grew up out of a certain kind of history, and so that really alienates me from the kind of white professorial guilt, which is very different, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Let's give Vidyan a round of applause. All of you, we have some books for sale. They will be signing books. You'd all please put your chairs up against one of the walls. I'd be very grateful. Thank you very much.
For receipt.
I
know.
Chosen which is basically
I need me.
Yeah, you got it.
Like me.
Okay. I think it's like Jenny's a pescatarian, Frank is a pescatarian, feels quite strongly about it.
No, I feel like I introduced myself before, and you should also probably introduce yourself.
I will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was reading the Guardian that, you know, like everyone's eating that.
No, but we're-
Everyone needs the crazy influence of saying things like the state. Yeah.
Every diet, everybody's.
Yeah.
You don't look bad. It's like a. Yeah, I know.
was interested in that.
It's.
Yeah.
No, it's in
Yeah.
It's not just, you don't have to.
Yeah. Well, I do want it to people to feel less intimidated by it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your reading. And actually, my boyfriend is in your bishop class, it was pretty long, so he wanted to come and put me in his desk, Bradford.
Oh, right, yeah.
And I wanted to ask you a bit about the Keats class that you're teaching.
Yeah, I'm going to teach it next semester.
Is there a sort of, I don't know, Keats sort of approach that you take to teaching?
It's called Keats as a death. So I was encouraged to teach it in terms of Keats' legacy. So I took an interest in the graduates as well. So we sort of look at all the Keats poems, but we also sort of connect into other poems. So sort of in terms by Keats, counts of poems. I try and choose the usual so we sort of jumped about. Yeah, it's usually a lot of fun. Like I added this assignment where people have to write a letter in response to it.